mean, money didn't mean anything to me, and didn't make any difference to me where she was from.
Durst also discussed the 9-year age difference between he and Kathie, because remember, he was 31 at the time they met, and she was just 19.
And was there any stigma attached to that at the time, or was that fairly common?
9 years is a long time.
Age difference-wise?
Yes, 9 years is an old time. I had oodles of education. She had zilch. Girl from a small town without, you know, no big deal. I mean, for me, I guess you would say I was marrying beneath me or something like that, or she was marrying up or well or something like that. But I never got there. I mean, money didn't mean anything to me, and didn't make any difference to me where she was from.
Every once in a while, by the way, because of all the editing that's involved, I don't think it happens a lot, but I noticed that there was an overlap on that clip with the last clip, so I don't think it's going to happen very often, but my apologies for that one. It was no, that was on me, so I apologize. On April 12th, I'm sorry. So Bob Durst also talked about the experience with Kathie's family and what it was like meeting them and how he interacted with them.
So these experiences with her family were kind of like Bob meets the average American family.
Well, more than meet, Bob is forced to spend time with the average American family. Bob is supposed to be polite and cooperative and pleasant and engage in the same conversations that they are, and I just couldn't do that. I just kept feeling like I should show them that I despise these things that they do,
And
ridicule these things that they do.
do you remember ridiculing in front of them?
Well, talking about my penis in front of Kathie's mother, that was about as extreme as I could imagine.
Yeah.
On April 12th, 1973, which was the defendant's birthday, he and Kathie were married. In October of that same year, they moved back to New York City. Now, at the time, Durst was working at the family-run Durst organization while Kathie attended nursing school in Connecticut. There are quotation marks around work because Mr. Durst is going to describe what he actually did there and what his work day was. And when you listen to him, he's brutally honest about it. He doesn't in any way make it sound like he was working.
I would show up for a meeting with 15 guys 2 hours late, stoned, wearing a t-shirt and a jock or whatever, and let everybody know that the way to waste a life is to sit around a big table and talk about gibberish documents all day long. And I was there infrequently. I'd never go in the morning. For an early, arrival for me would be after lunch.
Now the evidence is going to show, by the way, when you see these headphones...
Please make a note that I'd like to speak to the court after we recess on character. And
all right, is that an objection? Is that an objection or is it not?
yes, it is.
All right.
I assume I continue on?
It's just a moment. Don't conclude from any evidence that the defendant is disposed to commit crime.
Thank you. When you see, it's a little bit confusing, when you see this image, which is Bob Durst with headphones on, and seated next to him is Andrew Jarecki. You're going to hear evidence that the first time that Mr. Durst spoke to Andrew Jarecki was on December 11th, 2010. And he did that, the first thing they did was, they basically watched the movie, All Good Things, which we'll get to. And while they're watching the movie, Mr. Durst is commenting on what he is saying. So when you see the image of him with headphones, which you're seeing now, that is from the DVD commentary. And that's what we refer to it as. So that's basically the interview, and it's the first interview that took place. The evidence about Mr. Durst and his views about work or his views about entitlement have nothing to do with in any way arguing that because Mr. Durst had that viewpoint, he committed crimes or was in any way predisposed. The evidence will be brought to you and will be demonstrated to show that, in essence, Mr. Durst, in the way that he lived his life, from how he worked to how he committed crimes to how he covered up those crimes, was with an attitude of, in essence, I can do whatever I want. And that becomes important because in many of the ways that Mr. Durst committed the crimes, he was not very careful. And there's going to be evidence that you're going to hear where you're likely to be questioning, well, why would Mr. Durst have said that? Why would he have given this alibi witness? And that is what the purpose of this evidence is showing. So I want to be clear. In no way are we in any way arguing that because Mr. Durst had this attitude that he was predisposed to crime. He wasn't. All right, the Durst split their time between a penthouse at 37 Riverside Drive, which is on the Upper West Side of Manhattan, and an apartment on the Upper East Side of Manhattan at 12 East 86th Street. The evidence will show that when Kathie ends up going to medical school, the East 86th Street is much closer to Jacobi Hospital in the Bronx. They also end up purchasing a weekend lakeside cottage, which is an hour away in South Salem, which is in Westchester County, New York. So it's basically a lot of people live, they work in the city, and Westchester County is a beautiful area where people will buy houses and they'll commute in. So that's where they were living at the time. Now, from the beginning, the relationship between Bob and Kathie was unequal. Defendant was older, he was more experienced, he was more educated, he was wealthier. And he was also, the evidence is going to show, unfaithful from the start. During the marriage, Mr. Durst had a series of affairs with other women. Later on in the marriage, Kathie is also going to be unfaithful. Mr. Durst was confronted with a system that he had for what he would do when he would date other women. And in essence, what the evidence will show is that Mr. Durst would take Polaroid photographs of anything in their place that connected to Kathie. He would then take that stuff down and he would entertain women so that they would not know he was married. Now, Mr. Durst is going to be confronted about that by Mr. Jarecki in the next slide. And as you'll watch, Mr. Durst is going to, without shame, admit to the whole thing.
And what was the logic behind the Polaroids?
Just that. That I wanted this lady who I wanted to do not to know I was married.
Now, the evidence will also show that Mr. Durst strongly believed, and again, we've all known people who believe this way, that in essence, it was a double standard. He could cheat, but Kathie better not. But again, unlike most people, when Mr. Durst was confronted about it, instead of denying it or diverting, he voluntarily admits, that's my view.
Would you have been jealous if you knew that she was having an affair?
I'm sure I would have.
So you were proudly the bearer of the double standard that we all
Absolutely. It didn't bother me at all. I honestly, I never voiced it like that or thought it through like that, but the way I felt was I feel like having sex with somebody else, it's all right, but boy, you better not.
Now, from the beginning of the relationship, the defendant was very controlling of Kathie.
Well, I was always very controlling.
Now, he discussed an example of this controlling behavior, again, with Mr. Jarecki and Mr. Smurley during the 2011 interview.
And I think that she, at one point, I heard something about that you would ask Kathie to go to the social services office and pick up more food stamps, and she was very upset about that because she thought that was not right, or...
Yeah, I remember the food stamps thing. She thought we shouldn't be doing it.
And tell me, what do you remember about that? Or if
She didn't think we should be using food stamps when there's so little money available for the low-income programs. We don't need food stamps. Why are you doing it? And I think she felt embarrassed the supermarket with our food stamps.
Now, the importance of this evidence and what it's going to demonstrate is that over time, and given the difference in the power dynamic in the relationship, that he controlled her. And he got her to do things that she wouldn't have done. And over time, this conduct only escalated. In 1976, Kathie discovered that she was pregnant. This was Mr. Durst's reaction to her pregnancy. And again, these are his words, not mine.
Yes, Mr. Chairman. Given our discussion in the absence of the jury, this is character. This is an attempt to make him look bad.
So,
I've been very clear in
no, that's my concern isn't about, so if you hear evidence of, some of this is obviously negative about Mr. Durst's character, and ordinarily character is not relevant to prove any predisposition to commit crime. There is, at some point I'll give you instructions about domestic violence situations where the rule is slightly different. We'll talk about that at the appropriate time. As far as whether this is an argument, I think to some extent Mr. Lillingness is drawing some conclusions from facts, and when you infer, inference is the essence of argument, and so I will sustain the objection and allow you to get there.
Thank you, Ron.
And how do you remember her letting you know that she was pregnant? How did you find out?
She called me. She'd thrown up a couple of mornings, and she said she was going to see the doctor, and she called me during the day and said, I'm pregnant, and I want to keep this baby. And I said, I'm coming home. And I left the office and went back there, and we had a confrontation. I said, I told you from the beginning I didn't want children. There's no secrets. You agreed that we wouldn't have children. Now you're telling me you're pregnant, which, you're in charge of that stuff, not me. And you want to keep the baby. Well, you keep the baby, you're going to get divorced from me. Period.
During the 2015 interview, Mr. Durst further explained how the abortion changed the relationship. And the evidence will show that that was the beginning of the escalation of the domestic violence in the marriage.
By the time Kathie disappeared, you didn't feel the same way about her that you did before, right? I mean,
Oh, no. I mean, Gilberta has it right in her quote when she first met us. We were in love.
Right.
Period. No two ways about it. We were in love. That lasted about 2 years.
right,
And then we had the thing with the abortion.
right.
And that was the end of it.
Now, the evidence will show that Mr. Durst also sought to control Kathie with his money.
I would give Kathie a small budget. This is what you got for the week or month or whatever it is. If you want to spend more, don't talk to me about it.
But did she have any other source of income?
No,
So whatever she gave her was the
that
limit.
was it. Like we're getting an abortion, we're getting an abortion. This is how much money you got to spend this week or month, period.
Now, what was happening at this time? This is now, we're in the late 70s, around 1970 and 1980. What was going on in Susan's life at the time? So, after graduating from UCLA, Susan moved to the Bay Area to pursue a master's degree in journalism from UC Berkeley. After she graduated, she entered the professional world and became a successful journalist, writing for the San Francisco Examiner and for City Magazine. The evidence is going to show that Susan was somebody who had a very successful group of friends, female friends, and that early on, Susan kind of hit her stride much more quickly than they did. So she was kind of the star of her peer group. And what the evidence is going to show is that over time, Susan's life petered out and went downhill, whereas many of her friends became immensely successful. Now, one of the articles she wrote was on an aspiring musician named Nick Chabin. That is going to be the same Nick Chabin that is going to become a very close friend of Mr. Durst, and he's going to end up playing a very significant role in this case. Now, Susan and Nick would go on to become lifelong friends. The Susan eventually left the Bay Area for New York City, and where she continued to enjoy a lot of success writing, and among other periodicals, for the New Yorker. Chabin himself also later moved to New York City after divorcing his wife. And as a musician, he needed a day job. And the day job he ended up getting was as a copywriter for an advertising firm. Chabin and his separated wife sent their young daughter, Brandy, to live with Nick in New York City. Because Susan was still traveling back to San Francisco for work, Nick asked her if she would basically accompany Brandy back from San Francisco to New York. And Nick Chabin, when he testifies, is going to tell you that really cemented their relationship because of how kind Susan was to his daughter. Once in New York, Susan introduced Chabin to her very close personal friend, Bob Durst, or Bobby as she called him. The three would become very, very close, to some degree almost inseparable. Now, the defendant at the time was working for his father, and his father has one of the largest real estate conglomerates in all of New York City. And Nick Chabin sells advertising. So basically, Nick starts this job, and immediately Bob Durst sets him up with this giant account. So Nick is kind of like this very low-level guy, you know, like imagine the evidence. So imagine if you had gone to work at an ad agency, and you're right out of, new to the job, and then your first account is, hey, I can bring in Procter & Gamble. So it was a big deal to Nick. And Nick is going to describe to you, how, in essence, he believes that he owes all of his success to Bob Durst. That's going to end up being a significant issue in this case because the evidence is going to demonstrate that Nick Chabin, once he has very damaging information, is going to end up being heavily conflicted and does not want to turn on his friend.
I was doing advertising at an agency. I was a copywriter. And Bob called me one day and said, we have this new building we're building, 1155 Avenue of the Americas. You want to do the advertising for it? Well, this is an utterly strange question to ask a newbie in advertising if he would want to take control of a big account coming into an agency, the largest one at the agency.
And in getting this account, if I were to ask you, how instrumental was that in accelerating your career? What would be your response?
It was 100% responsible until I began to get other accounts because I had the Durst account. All I had to do was walk in somewhere and say, yes, I have the Durst organization account. I would get other accounts, which I wouldn't have gotten if I didn't have the Durst account.
So meanwhile, as the Durst marriage was headed downhill after the abortion, Kathie shifted her efforts to becoming a nurse. After graduation, she made the decision to apply to medical school, and in 1978, she was accepted by the Albert Einstein College of Medicine in New York City. During the 2011 DVD commentary, Bob Durst discusses Kathie's desire to become a doctor in what you'll hear is a very demeaning fashion, and which again will be evidence of the nature of the relationship.
Now, eventually, she did apply to medical school. Did you know that she was applying to medical school when she did?
Sure. It encouraged her to do so, but with a big caveat that the people who go to medical school get real good grades, do real good on the MCATs. They mostly come from much better colleges than you went to. You want to do it. She applied to 15 of them and got interviewed and accepted.
On the screen is a movie that's make-believe. This is improper.
The court has already admitted the all good things to be shown to the jury. I would ask Mr. DeGuerin to object to things that have not already been litigated in the middle of my opening.
Well, I ask that they not cherry pick from hours and hours and hours of interviews.
You present what you want to present, and I'll present what I want to present.
Will the court instruct Mr. Lewin that he's not supposed to direct his comments to other counsel?
I believe Mr. DeGuerin just directed a comment to me, Your Honor. It needs to go both ways.
Okay,
No.
stop. Breathe. Okay, please be seated, Mr. DeGuerin. I've heard your objections. And